Good evening and welcome to another Hot Topic where we discuss the issues affecting East Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire. Today we're talking about education and teachers. 11% increase in those leaving the teaching profession over the last 3 years. More people in a baby boom are going to need education in the coming years, and the profession is shrinking and money is short. Sixth form teachers are going to be on strike on the 15th of March, and primary school teachers are under bureaucratic pressure. To discuss this with me, I'm joined by Ken Rustage, I beg your pardon, Ken, who's the National Union of Teachers representative on the National Executive Committee for the whole of Lincolnshire and the East Riding of Yorkshire, including Hull and Grimsby. Ken, thank you very much for coming in. Let's start off with this strike coming up in the next week or so. This is teachers in sixth form colleges. What's making them take action?
Well, essentially a whole multitude of issues, but really the dreadful cuts. You know, there's been a 16% cut to funding to sixth form colleges under the old coalition government, and under the new Conservative government they're actually proposing another 8% cut. And the implications of this are larger class sizes, a restriction in the curriculum, you know, possible mergers, you know, and this really the way that the government is treating the sixth form colleges really is most unfair. So
it's not that they're striking for more pay?
Well, not as such, but that's part of the whole funding.
Well, let's take some of the consequences then of the cut in the money to sixth form colleges and the cut in the number of subjects offered. So the people that want to go and do A-levels, what are we losing? Are we losing important things like maths and history, or are we losing media studies?
Well, in short, the colleges have to make a difficult decision that they can no longer offer the range of subjects that students would wish to opt for, and that's basically on a numbers basis. So you just can't have a broad range of subjects that students would wish to do because of the cuts, and the colleges themselves have got to make that insidious decision.
And then is the breadth of subjects available not sort of self-selecting, as it were, if there is no student demanding to take an A-level in ancient Aramaic, then that would be a good reason not to offer a course in ancient Aramaic.
Clearly that would be the case, but what the government is doing is actually allowing a whole range of sixth form provision. For example, they're setting up of free schools and academies, and in places where there's no need for additional provision. So what you have, it's leading to profligacy. That really what would be better, we've got some brilliant sixth form colleges locally. You've got Franklin College in Grimsby, you've got John Legaton sixth form, you've got the very good colleges in Hull. But, you know, putting pressure on those by simply cutting the funding, and they're not getting the same funding that the schools are getting, but even the funding that the schools are getting is going to be drastically cut. Not as bad as the sixth form colleges, but the whole situation is deeply and profoundly unsatisfactory.
One of the things that will be cut from those sixth form colleges is the EMA. Which is the money given to students if they turn up.
Yeah, well, it's already been cut by a diabolical thing of the coalition government, that they ended that, the educational maintenance allowance for students from less advantaged families, and it was to give them a little bit of money to stay on in the sixth form. And it was a mean and despicable act by the previous government to cut this at the same time to give tax cuts to millionaires.
Why would you want to be teaching students who would only turn up in return for money? I mean, if they're not there for the sake of the education, for knowledge itself and all that sort of thing, if they're only coming to college to pick up a bit of pocket money, then is it worth investing in that education? Are these people qualified to be taking that expensive resource?
Most certainly they are qualified, and they wouldn't be able to opt to go into the sixth form unless they're up to a certain standard. But the point is that was just to give a little bit of money to allow those students to carry on. And once you've taken that finance away, it makes it very difficult. You could have a very bright student, you know, from a poorer family, who with this removing the educational maintenance allowance makes it very difficult for them to pursue their studies.
We have a certain amount of, beginning a little tradition of public sector strike action at the moment. The doctors, junior doctors, of course,
indeed.
Very much, and teachers. It's a one-day strike.
Yes.
Is it not sort of tactically unwise to declare beforehand how long your strike's going to last? Because if everybody is prepared and knows that there's a one-day strike going to occur, how likely is it to succeed in achieving its objectives?
Well, I think they were achieving the objectives, and the one thing, they were getting publicity. Of course, the government, this mean tactic, we expect them to do that. There's a judicial review, so it's got to go up to the High Court on Monday, and we'll find the result of that judicial review. We were ready for it, but Nicky Morgan has done this as a trick.
It's the Secretary of State for Education.
Yes, indeed. But we'll find out the result of that on Monday evening, and then from that, the action will take place on the 15th of March.
I should emphasise, as an ex-teacher, that just because the teachers are on strike, the students are expected to turn up and go to the library and study independently.
Well, that's the decision of the individual school or college. You know what that does.
I'm just being. It's my teacher's hat comes on too easy. I'm just a nag, I'm afraid, Ken. Now let's talk about primary schools.
Yes.
They have their own problems. They have not so much a cash problem, although that's part of it, but a bureaucracy problem.
Yes, indeed. I mean, at the present time, our primary colleagues are under dreadful pressure, as indeed all teachers are, with massive workload, 60, 70 hours a week are common, teachers working late into the night. Even Nicky Morgan herself said at the Tory party conference, she's hearing so much about this workload, we cannot go on like this, but they've done little or nothing about it. But added to that teachers now, primary school teachers, have got to fill in these grids with more than 3,000 pieces of work for each individual child to show why they've placed them at each level. And it's virtually impossible to do so. So we're really asking for clarification from the government. And I think the big problem is that teachers all say to me, our members say to me, why do they keep changing things all the time? This is exacerbating an already difficult situation.
Let me just get this right. There's 3,000 entries onto an EdXL chart or something like that,
yes.
Presumably,
for
each
yes.
child.
Yes.
And what, with details like, how good they are at finger painting or whatever?
Yeah, well, no, they've set a detail by filling in these grids, where they've evidenced that child is at this particular level in a particular area. We've asked the government for clarification on that, and so far nothing has come back.
Is this not, this is a little bit like Schrodinger's cat, isn't it? It's the measurement of the education actually replaces the education itself, and that more effort goes into making some sort of metric than what it is that is actually being judged.
Yes, absolutely. And essentially what's happening now, it's just schools are becoming exam factories. I was speaking to some former pupils last night, and they're saying, how it was, the happy days in the past, where teachers could have a dialogue with pupils, build up a relationship. That seems to have sadly deteriorated, and said it's just an exam factory, and schools are desperate to get up in the league tables, the dreadful league tables, in theoretically competing against each other. And that doesn't lead to good teaching, doesn't help relationships, and it can actually lead to disaffection by
and
many
deterioration in
pupils.
the quality. The measurement of the quality of education actually causes deterioration.
Yes,
in the quality of education.
Many pupils becoming disaffected as a result of this.
Now, you and I have been around the block a couple of times, and we mustn't fall into the old man's problem of saying, it's much better back in our day. But you mentioned exams there. We had exams, we had O-levels, we had A-levels, or GCSEs perhaps they have now, and maybe an exam that we did at 11 or 13 or something like that. And that was pretty much, of the public examinations, that was it. Are you suggesting that all exams are a waste of time, or that they're uninformative?
Oh no, most certainly not. I would never suggest that. I think there's a need, but I think obviously things have changed. For example, one of the things, would be coursework. There would be a percentage of that within an examination. But I think at the end of the day, there's no one saying that. Indeed, the way I had a paper, I was actually looking at a paper of the spelling, punctuation of grammar for primary school papers the government had produced, and it's like going back, as people were saying, to something from the 1950s.
Well, you see, this is where many people would say that it was better in the 1950s, and that people should be taught formal grammar and formal spelling and how to recite their 12 times table.
Well, I think that probably goes back to Gove's idea. Where did he go to school, or did he go to a private school somewhere?
No, he went to a state school in Aberdeen.
Well, he went to school in Scotland. I wasn't aware of that. But
well, we'll come on to that distinction about the difference between the English ethos of education and the Scottish ethos of education, because I have a suspicion that the Scottish is more successful, and that's a cultural thing rather than anything to do with money. But yes, sorry, to go back to that point, it should be the case that teachers are expected to teach grammar, at least, is it not?
Yeah, well, part thereof. Without going down into the weeds, but one of the things, get a lot of colleagues, teachers, interesting you say that, coming down from Scotland. People quite often, if the partner is in the RAF, you get obviously many RAF people in Lincolnshire.
Very much Lincolnshire,
and they'd say that the situation in Scotland is better. you know, in a whole multitude of ways. I'm not saying it's perfect in Scotland, there are issues there, but that is what people have said to me,
well,
that they you know, teachers like it, the system in Scotland, better than England and Wales.
And the whole culture of education out there, there are all sorts of reasons for that, going back to the Reformation as far as I can tell, Ken, but we won't go into too much detail about that. But we'll start talking about retention and recruitment in a moment. We must have a break there. Please join us again in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I'm still with Ken Rustage of the NUT talking about teacher retention and recruitment. Ken, over the last 3 years, the number of people leaving the teaching profession has gone up by 11%. The proportion taking early retirement has gone up from 64 to 75%. It's pretty high at 64%. And more than half of new teachers leave the profession within 2 years.
Yes.
Why do people hate teaching so much?
Well, I mean, at the end of it, the buck stops with the government. I mean, what people say, you know, the clipboard mentality, as already alluded to, filling in charts. It's not like it was. The older teachers, they say, you know, how it's changed and not for the better. I mean, there's a whole multitude of issues, you know, as to why that is the case. I mean, it's particularly acute in Lincolnshire, the recruitment crisis, to try to get people to come to Lincolnshire, you know, from elsewhere. I mean, it was pointed out to me that now the situation is that in one of our schools, more than 50% of the teachers, or the so-called the person in front of the classroom, is not actually a qualified teacher. You know, they're actually having to put someone in there.
Now, in Lincolnshire specifically, there's a sort of an aspect of geography to this, because once you
Yes.
get east of the A1,
Yes.
you're a little bit off the beaten track, and people
Yes.
perceive it as being a bit remote.
Yes. I mean, that's the problem. When the A1 corridor, you know, you've got that, and once you get away from the proximity of the A1 corridor, added to that, you know, you say the problem's exacerbated by the fact that you're on the coast, so you can only really recruit from 180 degrees. The other 180 degrees, you're in the North Sea. So.
And it's a pity, because people don't know quite how beautiful and wonderful and lovely Lincolnshire is.
Oh yes, indeed. You know, I think it's a wonderful place. I'm always saying that. I was in Lincoln yesterday and looking out of school, looking over the wonderful cathedral, and say, what a nice place. And people from elsewhere in the country, if you like, you know, young graduates coming into that, I think they should come to Lincolnshire, you know, and to the East Riding of Yorkshire and places in between. There's a wonderful thing. You know, if you go into you've got some good towns as well. You know, we've got Grimsby and Scunthorpe, and you can go into the city of Hull as well. You know, there's plenty there, and also nice places in the rural locations too.
Might it be something to do with money? Teachers are paid, as recent advertising, they've been trying to do this recruitment campaign on television with slightly controversial figures, but a starting salary for a teacher is about £22,000 outside London. And I've done a bit of research into other things. If you've gone on for a few years as a teacher, maybe you're approaching your mid-30s, chances are earning about £30,000, £35,000?
Yes, indeed, and considering, you know, that teacher is an all-graduate profession, just how poor that is. You know, it starts off behind other graduate professions. So, you know, so you go into that, you're behind when you start off, and as time goes on, you get farther and farther behind. Of course, when you go back in time, that people who went into teaching, they would go into teaching probably not for the money, they were reasonably paid, but also one of the things they used to say that you would get a good pension at the end of it. But now what the government has done, they've attacked the pensions. So I think it's an attack on all fronts against the teaching profession, and that really answers your recruitment and retention crisis. You know, older teachers saying that they want to get to the point and be able to get out. In future, teachers having to go on to 68 to get the pension. Well, it's not realistic. That, you know, people are tired out, you know, at a much younger age than that, and this is again something that the government has done. It's a bit like putting the foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. It doesn't make any sense.
You mentioned that it's competing with other graduate professions. I'm not so sure you're right there, and cheerfully or uncheerfully, depending on how you look at it. I've done a bit of research. Solicitors at about the same age and accountants at about the same age are making about the same money, £35,000. Talking about sort of early, little bit before mid-career here, whilst you're still young. But that's about the same amount of money as electricians and plumbers, which are not graduate professions. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the accountants and solicitors are underpaid if they're getting about the same as teachers, or that the electricians and plumbers are overpaid if they're getting the same money as the graduate professions?
Well, across the piece. I think really, it's a public sector, all public sector workers. You've got to look at that, and at the present time, the private sector, people can earn more money across the piece than they can do that, and those are the figures. You'll be really drilling down into that someone might want to become a plumber. Indeed, I know, funny you should say that. I know a teacher who said he actually packed in and said it went actually to become a plumber, and he said he's fed up and said, I'm my own boss now, I don't have to have all that nonsense. And that is point in fact. But I think you've got to look at that. We want the best for the future generations. We want the best teachers to come into it. As I've said before, people who came into teaching traditionally didn't come in for the money. We want people to be paid reasonably well and fairly, but also the pension. When this attack on pensions, asking people to go on to 68, actually move the goalpost, that is something that is particularly unfair, because people say, I'll work as hard as I can, but at the end of it, they just cannot go on. And we had lots of discussions with the government about that. They're saying, how can we get people to work on longer? It's not realistic, and it's not just teachers; it's all public sector workers.
Well, there's an element there. Of expecting people to work longer for their pensions if they're going to get their full pensions, but at the same time, schools, colleges, in order to save money, the older, more senior teachers are more expensive, and the younger, freshly trained teachers are much cheaper. And so there's a temptation to constructively dismiss, is what the legal phrase would be, but to make it impossible for the older teachers to remain in order just to save money. Now, does that happen? Is that a policy that headmasters and headmistresses
certainly
make?
Those are a national trend. There's absolutely no question about this. There seems to be a national trend to target older teachers, particularly female teachers, where they put under capability and what have you, and then of their own volition. Of course, with the changes in pensions going back a few years, it used to be 50, but now the earliest you can access a pension presently is 55. You would actually lose 5% on each year up to 60, but that's being changed. So in future going forward, you won't be able to access your pension at that age, or any pension you would get before that will be massively poor. So what used to happen before, you would have people would go up to 60 or go a little bit earlier, they could access the pension, maybe go part-time, maybe go on to supply, something like that would carry on, and then schools would then recruit younger teachers, which, as you said already, theirs will be cheaper. But with the government policy into pensions, that's going to be difficult. So I see another problem going forward in the future, where people quite simply with the pensions and the amount of pensions be attacked so much that they won't be able to do that.
And so that just more people will be finding something else, becoming plumbers, because it's better paid and less stressful.
Well, goodness, I can't, in your late 50s, early 60s, you get too old. I think you find it very difficult to start to retrain at that age. I think basically, you'll be, put in a poorer position, almost, with the pensions age going up all across the piece, you could be into some sort of poverty, which is very sad.
You talked about the quality of teaching and the necessity to get the best people in. How successful is that? Most teachers are graduates of a subject matter, of physics or geography or whatever it is, but then they have to go through another year's teacher training. That can be expensive. Who pays for that?
Well, that's a policy to try and get people, but that's not how most people are coming to teaching profession now. The situation is so bad. They're getting lots of people going to go teach direct. And also, you mentioned that point, another thing the government has done, it's now, not an all-graduate profession, they've moved that away. Again, it's an attack on, presumably if you're going into a sixth form college and you're going to be teaching any subject, say, for example, physics or geography or history, hopefully you would have a degree in that, if you've not got that. But again, the government has, again, weakened it, so people can come into that. There's some good people who can come in, older people quite often with life experience, they'll come into that. But again, this is the problem with the recruitment crisis, you already said. So hitherto it would be from the universities, they go on and do a PGCE and they go into teaching. Now that's not the case.
Postgraduate certificate in education.
That's right. Well, that's now a lot less, and that's an area now that is not, it's a minority of people coming into the profession for that. The majority of people now are coming in from, schools direct, teach direct, going through these agencies to try and get people in. As you mentioned, all the misleading adverts that are being put out by the government.
Well, the point of contention with the adverts is that the great teachers, it says, get £65,000, but they're very, very few. It's generalising from the particular. There are very, very few.
It is, and it's an outrageous thing to say.
Talking about that PGCE, having got one, the PGCE is not a very high bar to jump. It's not a very impressive qualification.
I would disagree. I think a lot of people would go and do a degree, and then hitherto then from that with a degree do 1 year's specialist training to go into schools. So I think if you if you've just done a degree in, say, for example, history, then you then go away and do a PGC, so you'd learn about the whole range of teaching, primary school, secondary school, going into sixth form college. And that's just a 1 year to sharpen you up. That was the traditional method that people went in. The other method, of course, was to do a BEd, a Bachelor in Education, or if you go back in years gone by, a certificate in education that people would go in and study straight away. I think that was the traditional routes. I think those routes were good routes, but things have moved on, and I think we've already said that's why there's a crisis in recruitment in teaching generally.
In much of that training, I don't know about the Bachelor of Education, but in the PGCE, much of that course itself isn't about teaching, it's about the bureaucracy of teaching, it's about the measurement of teaching, it's about the gradations and the office work and the government policy. It's not about how to stand in front of a room full of young people and make sure that they know what you know.
Again, I would disagree completely. I myself did a PGC at the University of Liverpool, and it was anything but the kind. It was all the different schools in Liverpool, a very intensive course, and I think a lot on some of the things I learned then, still go hark back to that all those years ago. So it's just not the case at all.
It's well, we're going to have to stop there for a minute, Ken, but we'll come back to that. We'll talk about the training of teachers and what the NUT can do to try to change these policies. But we're back in a second. Join us after these couple of minutes. Welcome back. I'm still with Ken Rustage of the National Union of Teachers, talking about why there are so few of them. Ken, funding is not consistent throughout the whole country, is it? There's a policy which means that, to some extent, which region you're in depends on how much money will be spent on the education of your children.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the funding system that's presently used is now actually quite outdated. For example, what the present situation is now is the highest funded authority, and whether it be an academy or a state school, the money is given out per pupil depending on where you are. The highest funded one is presently Tower Hamlets, and the lowest funded one in the entire country is the East Riding of Yorkshire. It was previously Cambridgeshire, and there's a massive difference within it. For example, a special school in Barnsley, a virtually identical special school in Hackney, would get double the funding. But what we're saying in the NUT, that we want the funding raised across the piece. I mean, possibly the reasons why the funding was different, particularly in the case of Tower Hamlets, because that was the #1 poorest area in the entire country. And so that money was to help those children. But what's happened, the government is now looking at these figures, and I've actually seen earlier this week, they actually showed me the new figures that have come out, and the funding will change. But across the piece, in real terms, things are getting worse, not better.
How much does it cost in Lincolnshire or the East Riding of Yorkshire per student per year? What is the cost?
Yeah, well, within the funding they get per year is based for each individual pupil. I mean, without quoting the figures off the top of my head, it's something like £8 per pupil in Tower Hamlets, down to something like £3 per pupil.
I meant, forgive me, in total, the cost of education per student, per pupil, per year. What is the
again,
cost
without looking at the figures themselves, I mean, it's a significant amount of money. I was saying in this league table, the funding going forward, it actually had a list of all the funding depending on the area. And, I mean, you look at them, for example, Birmingham, it was something about, off the top of my head, it was a very high figure because obviously Birmingham City is a very high population. And, I mean, talking specifically about the figures, the new ones, under the proposals, the area, there's only one place in the whole country that actually gets, in real terms, an increase, and that is Barnsley. The East Riding will get some extra money, but it will still, in real terms going forward, will be a cut for the children in East Riding. Right down at the bottom of the table is now the City of London, and that, with taking into account the different funding and the cuts, it will actually lose 41% of money in real terms going forward. So the situation is difficult now, but looking forward, it's going to get much worse.
I think the total for per pupil per year in the East Midlands, outside London, in provincial England, as it were, and this is an average and a vague figure, but it's north of £15,000 a year per student. Does that sound about right?
Well, without looking at the figures, I don't know. I mean, I'll take your words for it.
Well, if it is, that's about the equivalent of the school fees for a private education. Why is it then that if people they choose to send their children to a private education when that no more money is going into the education of that student, £15,000 here, £15,000 there? Why is it that they choose the private education rather than the public sector?
Well, that's a parental choice. I mean, I think in real terms, you look at like Eton and Harrow, you look at the class sizes.
Well, they're rather more expensive.
I'm talking, like that.
Not talking about.
Well, there you go. You're saying, I mean, we've got members in private schools. I was in a private school earlier this week, and a very nice thing. I mean, I think probably the reasons people send the kids to private schools, it could be, for example, within the military, if they were posted abroad or in Cyprus or somewhere. People historically have done that. And I think they actually get some funding, or used to do, from the military to help that for the children. That has now actually been cut. There used to be, for example, state boarding schools. I had an uncle who sadly passed away, who actually used to teach in a state boarding school that used to have many service children in the past.
Is that not a model to go forward? Because one of the problems, you talked about Barnsley, you talked about Tower Hamlets, there are very poor areas of the country where you need to spend more money per student because of the poverty, and the reason that the poverty impacts on the quality of the education, if I may use impact as a verb, which my teachers would have been very cross about, is that if you come from a household which doesn't contain a book or a fresh vegetable, that's not going to give you the sort of intellectual curiosity or the habit of learning that you might have if you come from a more fortunate household. So that's why it's more expensive to educate where people are poorer. Is that not, is that logic right?
Well, I mean, up to a point, but I mean, that money going in is obviously for the buildings and everything. There's a whole multitude of things that comes through. I mean, one of the problems what the government has done, that it's giving, in some areas, giving over provision. What the NUT believes there should be a good school for all children. Ideally, all the schools should be so good, and people shouldn't wish to want to send the kids to a private school because the state system is so good. Indeed, people were saying that only yesterday. People were saying, look, the state schools are very, very good. But I think that the issue is that what the government is doing is that it's actually getting over provision. So you're not on overall control, and going forward, it needs to be overall control, i.e. in places where there's already sufficient places, there's free schools and various other things are being set up, so there's more places. That means there's less pupils available to go in, and places where there's a need to have more school places, the local authority can't build them, and that there's really a chaos. And I mean, what that means with all the cuts, it means larger class sizes. I mean, you say within why people send kids to private schools. I mean, what's the average class size in Eton and Harrow? If you look at some of the class sizes, I was dealing with NQT last week, he said he got 34 in a class. Interestingly, another one, going back, the class size was only 9 in that class, so it depends on where you are. So really, what the government is doing doesn't really make much sense into what the situation is now. But we think that what should really happen in all those places, if you talk locally, in Grimsby and Scunthorpe and Hull, that those places, they need more money. And indeed, especially in the East Riding of Yorkshire, that money should be raised across the piece. Not being the insidious position where the schools have less money, they're having to look to make teachers redundant, good teachers redundant. What would be better to have smaller class sizes and to keep the experienced teachers. We want the best for all the children.
And that means building more classrooms as well as employing more teachers. That's more money spent on the infrastructure and the physical resources as well.
Well, I mean, yes, indeed. I mean, dependent where you are. I mean, the old government had the building schools for the future and some magnificent buildings.
When you say the old government, do you mean the coalition or the Labour government?
The Labour government.
I should just point out that you did stand for the Parliament for the Labour Party at the last general election. So I only point that out for the perfectly respectable political point of view.
Yeah.
But that's where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, I'm just pointing out a fact when it's the politics that the old government, the building schools for the future. For example, one of the last ones built, I was up in a school in Scunthorpe, and a very, very pleasant place that was, very spacious. I thought, what a wonderful building this is. But since the coalition government got in 2010, that was cut. So you have many children today, still being taught in very, very poor, conditions, quite often classrooms, lots of mobile classrooms. If suddenly, the population goes up, and it depends where you are in the country, but if the population is suddenly going up, they have to put in mobile classrooms, things like that, generally poor facilities. So and
coming into the secondary schools now at the age of 11, there is a bit of a baby boom. There is a a rise in the demand, I suppose, of the number of pupils coming in.
Yeah, so I think, for that, really people should be able to plan ahead, and, someone at a local level should be able to make that provision, not to have the chaos of trying to do things at the last minute.
Does the role of teachers become less important as technology improves? I know that when I was a teacher, then every student had a beautiful, great big Apple Mac computer in front of them, and sometimes 20 of these things in a room. I was very aware of the fact that I was by far the cheapest teaching resource in that room. Does the technology make the human presence in a classroom less necessary? And in fact, can people not get an education by sitting at home?
Yeah, well, no, not really. I think you can't get away from the human presence. We're not like robots. We're not like out to school in the outback of Australia, where you've got to have a lesson down the line. I mean, they have got technology, and there's definitely a place for technology. And I mean, my perception of how things have improved. When I was teaching 20 odd years ago, you'd ask the children to go and look something up. They go down to a library. It was very difficult to find things. Now, instantly they can look on the internet. They can study things further.
Yes, but they can't believe the internet. That's the problem. Is they get into the habit of believing all the garbage that there is online.
Absolutely. Well, that's another issue. You said, dreadful. But the technology can be used as a good thing, but you cannot replace the teacher. Though we can have that personal interaction.
There's the NUT, amongst all sorts of other educational interest groups, is what Michael Gove, and he was Secretary of State for Education, called the blob. There was a sort of an ideological objection to various of his ideas and his changes. One of the aspects of the blob is there's a dedication to comprehensive education, and there's a dedication to the idea that everybody has to get a pat on the back. Is that positive? Is that constructive?
Well, I mean, I think Michael Gove is one of the most divisive education ministers in recent times.
That doesn't mean he's wrong. Divisive can sometimes be quite good.
I would think, in my view, much of the things that he did, were absolutely wrong. I mean, interestingly, with Michael Gove, he was a journalist, and he was in the National Union of Journalists, and he did actually go on strike, and then he was saying things. But he's gone. He's yesterday's place. Some of the damage he's done, that we're actually coming up to that, and some of the things that he's done in his tenure as Education Secretary, he was in there long enough, and all it says, to go back to my original point, the retention and recruitment crisis that's been caused by things that he did on his watch.
Okay, when it comes round, I think we'll come back in the next half. We'll talk about the blob and that culture within the teaching profession a little bit more, and maybe we'll talk about Michael Gove and Scottish education as well, Ken. But please join us again in a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Hot Topic. We're talking about the crisis in teaching at the moment and education. My guest is Ken Rustage of the National Union of Teachers. We were talking about what Michael Gove called the blob, and there is a certain possibly comfortable consensus amongst most of the teaching profession about the way certain things should be done. I would suggest that the purpose of education is to produce people who can think for themselves independently with an analytical mind, who can spot the mistakes in an argument, who are articulate and eloquent and can express themselves, and who have a field of reference. And yet I come across people coming out of the school system who are perfectly intelligent and who could not name a play written by Shakespeare or any sums sorted out by Pythagoras. Education's failing, isn't it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you already alluded to earlier about the technology. Things have changed. I think Shakespeare's on the curriculum now, and people decide that. You go back, for example, in the history curriculum, that's been changed. And it keeps being changed on a whole multitude of things. But of course, if you ask someone a specific question, they can, quite easily, they can go and look that up and find out.
I don't stop 16-year-olds on the street and ask them for Pythagoras' theorem. I should emphasise.
I mean, people probably say, if you go back in time, like we were saying earlier in the 1950s, the curriculum. I had a debate with the former Conservative MP, and he was on about that, going back to the old days. But the world has changed. It isn't like that now. Is Pythagoras necessary? All those other things. It's a broad thing that is needed. And when you look at that, the thing I am aware of is how hard the teachers work. People don't go into the teaching profession for the money. It'd be better to do something else for the money. They go in because they're a passion. It's almost a vocation. They want the students to do well. And I think at the end of the day, people want their students to do their very best to be prepared for the world outside when they left school. Education is something that is can improve the lives of people, can actually give them the facility. Many of the form pupils I've taught come back to me and say that, and say, I really appreciated it when I was at school. And I think back in time, and I want the best for the next generation.
There is also a possibility, and this was one that Mr. Gove might have agreed with, that the purpose of education is to produce economic units. That there's no point in people coming out of school and then the companies that might employ them complain that they're not numerate or they're not very good at expressing themselves. Now that's sad, but is that the purpose of education?
No, I think education has got to be much broader than that. We're not just going through, like a sausage factory, prepared people, for some life of drudgery in a factory or something. Not that there's many factories left. I think, education is for life. It's a broader thing. It's an interest in a multitude of topics. Like you're saying, students who want to go in the sixth form colleges and go and study the subjects that they want to do. Because they're having to cut them down, that opportunity is being taken away from students, by that. And I think Michael Gove did a lot of damage, his ideas. I mean, interestingly, I saw him speak. He came into Hamilton House before the election.
This is the headquarters of the
EDUT in London. Yes, and I was next to the General Secretary, Christine Blow, and I asked him some questions, and he's a very articulate man. But what Christine said to me, says, just listen to what he hasn't said. But he was very clever, very articulate, and he said this thing. But of course, we didn't realise what's going to happen when he took over and he did things. I mean, this big programme was the academisation, the free schools, and all these things. And I think his policies. People said to him, people went abroad and said this is dreadful and this is not the right thing. I think elsewhere, somewhere like in Finland, that's somewhere that's held up where people have said, that is a really good education system. But people elsewhere in North America and elsewhere were saying, his direction, didn't seem to be helpful internationally.
Well, we've mentioned Michael Gove quite a lot in this interview, mostly because most of the most recent reforms in education, the big ones, were under his stewardship as Secretary of State for Education. But also, we mentioned him in the context of the fact that he went to a state school in Scotland. You've mentioned Finland. Scotland, the education system is more successful. And I can't give you statistics, but you just are aware of the fact that you're surrounded by people who are more articulate and have a greater field of reference in Scotland, even if it is just Robert Burns.
Yes,
You mentioned Finland. What is it that the Scots are doing differently? What is it that the Finns are doing differently to the way we're doing it here? Yes,
well, that's a very good point. I mean, historically, the Scottish educational system has been different, and I get quite a few members who've come down from Scotland. I mean, one thing, if they've gone to university, it's a 4-year university course. I mean, but they always have the legal system is different. I think historically, education was back in time. You go back in history, was held in higher esteem. I remember reading something in history where someone said they got a letter a few hundred years ago, and they said, quickly come find a Scotsman who's in the village so he can read it and say what he says. Because people historically, people are almost held back. The tradition was, the rich man at his castle, the poor man at his gate, all things bright and beautiful, and people were actually almost held down by this system. It's almost like a tradition.
In England, but not in Scotland.
But not in Scotland. So maybe historically that could be some of the reason. I think elsewhere you look at the models in Finland. It's a system where teachers are held in a higher esteem. They paid better. The Finnish system. Michael Gove was saying on the Swedish system, where the Swedish system, when we actually looked at it, has created a whole series of problems. But I think you need to look at places elsewhere. I mean, it's like you've touched on a point about Scotland, and maybe we need to look at that and what is the best. But I don't think the direction that things are going in, not least with the cuts to funding, not least with the chaos of education, where there's over-provision in some areas, under-provision in other areas, going forward is the best thing. I think it needs people to get together, get all the best people together to move forward in a better way.
I just want this as purely as an excuse to mention one of my favourite quotations. The historian G.M. Trevelyan wrote about the Scottish education system in the Reformation. John Knox insisted that everybody had to be able to read the Bible for themselves, so it was the first country in Europe to have almost universal literacy. G.M. Trevelyan's comment was that the Lowland Scots had the best educated peasantry in Christendom, which I think is magnificently condescending. You have a Labour Party, you're a Labour Party member, you're a Labour Party parliamentary candidate. What is the Labour Party, were it to come to power tomorrow, what would the Labour Party do about the education system?
Well, I mean, it's not going to come to power tomorrow, and there's a present debate going on in the Labour Party. You've got some good new people who are coming over. You've got the Schools Minister, Nick Dakin, very, very good MP
Nick
over in
Dakin, of course, is the Member of Parliament for Scunthorpe, one of our local members.
He is indeed, and he's got tremendous experience, so it's very, very interesting what he's said. He's just written a very good article in the Teacher magazine, about, the dreadful things that are happening to the sixth form colleges. Lucy Powell, the Member of Parliament for Manchester Central, who's the Shadow Education Secretary, she's looking at areas. But what we're actually doing is the Labour Party is listening to us, we're talking to people. They're not putting together policies so far in. They're looking at the situation. They're not going to get in power until 2020, at least until 2020. You know, who knows what's going to happen? You know, Harold Wilson said a week's a long time in politics. But they are taking on board something. We're talking to them, we're in discussion with them, as we're in discussion with people in the other parties. You know, it isn't just the Labour Party, you know, there's the Green Party, the Liberals, you know, and even the Conservatives, you know, across the piece. We're talking to politicians, and that's the way it should be, across all political spectrums. But what we want is the best for all the children going forward. And I don't think with what's going on at the present time, self-evidently in terms of the funding cuts, it is going to lead to the best. You know, you're going to cut the sixth form provision, if you across this, just to name but one thing, that's not going to be the best thing for the people in Grimsby and Scunthorpe and Hull.
So the answer is just spend more money?
Well, be careful how the money is spent, and well, the government is spending more money, but it's wasting that money with just giving over provision, you know, setting up free schools, academies, getting people to compete against each other. So it's not wise, they're not spending the money wisely. For example, I'll give you an example, supply agencies. If you've got, interestingly, one of the best ones in Northern Ireland, they still have a state supply agency, and it's a far more efficient system. Some places, you know, having to spend to go to these agencies, and to actually get to the agency, they have to spend £60,000 to join. So the scarce resources to go into that,
well,
and then
the school has
to, you know, to go to this agency to get someone when someone's off. Wouldn't it be better to have things, you know, like it was in the old days? We had, you know, the local council, they would actually provide that agency. You actually get, if someone's off sick, you can get a supply teacher. You know, if someone's, you know, we need a physics teacher or a maths teacher, as you said, we can get a supply teacher who's got an expertise as a maths teacher to come in. We want the best for all the children. I think by what the government is doing, and you know, this break up, the privatisation of education, that's definitely not thing. That's wasteful of money.
But is that creation of competition? Does that not mean does that not improve standards all round by the fact that parents can choose what they perceive to be the better place for an education?
Well, I mean,
everybody has to up their game in order to compete.
That's a good point. We've always had competition, but I don't think that the way this is going on is like that. I mean, it's quite the reverse. It's wasteful. You know, it's not like you know, a private company or a supermarket or something like this. It's, you know, there is only a limited amount of resources. You know, it is a state education system. You know, so if you're going to fritter away that money on all these other things, and you have over provision, you know, that's senseless. What you're going to have the perverse situation where you're going to have larger class sizes. You're going to have to make teachers redundant, deliver less. You know, it doesn't make any sense with what the government is doing.
So. How do you improve it then? I mean, not in terms of not spending money on it, but how do you improve that attitude, that ethos in the schools? What does raise the level of the education?
Well, I think there have been some success stories in recent years. I remember, like in London, it was held up, you know, 5-10 years ago, was not doing very well. But then they had the thing called the London Challenge, where you got all the schools in London all working together, and verifiably the standards did improve as a result of that. So I think what I'd like to see is and it is starting to happen a little way, is, you know, people all work together. I mean, the government has brought in these schools commissioners, but already in the Educational Select Committee, they're upset with that because these are not elected people. But I mean, maybe there's a move in that direction, maybe to go back in history. You have the school boards, and then what that came into, you have the local authorities. Because the local authorities, the power has been taken away. Okay. So I mean,
I'm sorry to have to stop you there, but I will stop you on that, I think, partially optimistic note. Anyway, with a little bit of a happy smile to the future. But thank you very much for coming in. That's it for tonight's Hot Topic. Join in the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag Hot Topic. Email your views on the Hot Topic to news@estuary.tv. And until next time, goodbye.